In the last days of April 1945, deep inside the Führer bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler was doing something that no rational person in his position should have been doing. He was waiting to be rescued. The Soviet army was less than a mile away. The city above him was burning. His generals were dead, or captured, or retreating as fast as their exhausted forces could move. His closest allies had already begun negotiating their own surrenders behind his back. And Hitler was standing over a map table, moving units that no longer existed, planning a relief operation that every professional soldier around him knew was a fantasy, and waiting for one specific man to arrive and save him. That man was Walter Wenck. He commanded the 12th Army, the last coherent German military force on the Western Front, the last real army that Germany had left. Hitler had personally ordered him to turn his forces around, abandon the Americans he was facing, drive east through Soviet lines, and relieve Berlin. Hitler trusted Wenck completely. He believed Wenck was coming. He told everyone in the bunker that Wenck was coming. He made his final military decisions based on the assumption that Wenck was coming. Walter Wenck was not coming. And the decision he made instead, the decision to take that army in a completely different direction, while Hitler waited and hoped and slowly understood that nobody was coming to save him, is one of the most extraordinary acts of deliberate disobedience in the entire history of the Second World War. This is the story of Walter Wenck, the last general Hitler trusted, and the one who betrayed him. Walter Wenck was born on September 18, 1900, in Wittenberg, into a military family that pointed him toward a soldier's life from the beginning. He was part of the generation that was just slightly too young for the First World War, old enough to be shaped by it, old enough to feel the particular mixture of national humiliation and martial pride that defined young German men of his era, but young enough that his actual military formation happened in the Reichswehr of the Weimar years, rather than in the trenches of the Western Front. This turned out to matter in ways that are not immediately obvious. The officers who came up through the trenches carried the First World War in their bodies and their psychology in ways that affected everything they did afterward. Wenck's formation was different, more professional, more detached, shaped by the precise and rigorous military education of the interwar period, rather than by the visceral experience of industrial slaughter. He developed into a staff officer of exceptional quality, the kind of operational mind that understands not just how to execute a plan, but how to construct one, how to look at a situation with all its constraints and variables and find the solution that actually works rather than the solution that looks good on a map. Through the 1930s, he rose steadily through the Wehrmacht's ranks, accumulating the experience and the reputation that would eventually bring him to Hitler's attention. He served in France in 1940, in the Balkans, and then on the Eastern Front, where the scale and intensity of operations gave staff officers of his caliber the opportunity to demonstrate what they could do at a level that peacetime service never provides. By the middle years of the war, he had established himself as one of the most capable operational planners in the German army. Not a famous name in the way that Rommel or Guderian were famous names. Not the kind of general who attracted press coverage or public attention, but the kind of general that other generals wanted on their staff when the situation was genuinely difficult and the margin for error was zero. In early 1945, he was appointed Chief of the Army General Staff, one of the most senior positions in the entire Wehrmacht, a job that put him at the center of German strategic planning in the final months of the war. He was 44 years old. The war was obviously lost. Germany was being compressed from both sides, Soviet forces driving from the east, American and British forces driving from the west. And the only questions that remained were how long the collapse would take, and how many more people would die before it was complete. Wenck sat in planning meetings and looked at maps that told a story with only one possible ending, and he did his job with the professional precision that had characterized his entire career, because that is what professional soldiers do, even when the cause is lost. Then in February 1945, something happened that changed his situation dramatically and almost killed him before the story reached its most important moment. He was driving back from a briefing late at night, exhausted after days without proper sleep, and he fell asleep at the wheel. His car went off the road and rolled down an embankment. He suffered serious injuries, broken ribs, a fractured skull, injuries that put him in hospital for weeks at a point in the war when weeks were everything. He was still recovering when April arrived, and the Soviet offensive that would end the war in Europe began its final push toward Berlin. Hitler needed an army. More precisely, Hitler needed the last army. The 12th Army had been assembled on the Elbe River facing the Americans, a scratch force of whatever units could be gathered together. Young soldiers, old soldiers, men pulled from training establishments and rear area units, and the remnants of formations that had been destroyed and reconstituted so many times they barely existed as coherent organizations. It was not, by the standards of the Wehrmacht's peak years, an impressive force. But in April 1945, it was real, it was organized, it was in the field, and it was the last thing resembling a complete German army that existed on the Western Front. Hitler ordered it east. He ordered Walter Wank, still not fully recovered from his injuries, to take command of the 12th Army, turn it around, drive through the Soviet forces surrounding Berlin, and relieve the capital. He told Wank that this operation would decide the outcome of the war. He told him that Berlin must be held. He told him that the fate of Germany depended on what the 12th Army did in the next few days. Wenck looked at the orders. He looked at his maps. He looked at the forces available to him, and the forces opposing him, and the distances involved, and the state of the roads and the supply situation, and every other variable that a professional operational planner looks at when he is assessing whether something is possible. And he understood immediately, with complete clarity, that what Hitler was ordering him to do was not possible. The 12th Army could not fight through the Soviet forces surrounding Berlin. The Soviet forces surrounding Berlin were not a thin screen that could be penetrated by a determined thrust. They were a massive concentration of armor and infantry and artillery that had been building for weeks, that outnumbered anything Wenck could bring to bear by margins that made the arithmetic of the operation obvious. A serious attempt to drive to Berlin would destroy the 12th Army without relieving Berlin, leaving nothing between the Americans on the Elbe and the complete collapse of whatever remained of organized German resistance in the West. But Wank also understood something else, something that had nothing to do with military calculations and everything to do with the human reality of what was happening around him. Between his army and Berlin, in the forests and along the roads, and huddled in whatever shelter they could find, there were civilians. Hundreds of thousands of German civilians, refugees from the East who had been fleeing the Soviet advance for months, people from the areas that Soviet forces had already overrun, people who had heard the stories of what happened to German civilians in the path of the Soviet offensive, and were terrified of being caught. They were old people and women and children and wounded soldiers and all the categories of human being that end up on the wrong side of a collapsing front. They were trapped between the Soviet forces closing in from the east and the Elbe River to the west, and the Americans were on the other side of the Elbe, and the Americans were not shooting civilians. Wenck made his decision. He would advance east. He would make the motions of a relief operation toward Berlin, enough to satisfy the reporting requirements, enough to maintain the appearance of compliance with his orders, enough to keep Hitler believing that Wenck was coming. But the real objective of the 12th Army's movement was not Berlin. The real objective was to open a corridor to those civilians, to hold that corridor long enough for as many people as possible to reach the Elbe, and then to surrender to the Americans rather than the Soviets. He discussed this with his corps commanders. He was not hiding what he intended. The men who would execute his orders understood what they were doing and why. This was not a secret plan concealed from his own staff. It was a collective decision made by professional soldiers who looked at their situation and decided that their actual duty, the duty to the people they were supposed to be protecting, pointed in a different direction than their orders. In the Führerbunker, Hitler waited. Updates came in about the 12th Army's progress. The reports were interpreted as signs that Wenck was fighting his way toward Berlin. Hitler told his staff that Wenck would arrive. He made decisions based on Wenck's arrival. In the bizarre parallel reality of the bunker, where a man who had started a war that killed tens of millions of people was now reduced to moving imaginary units on a map and waiting for a rescue that was not coming, the name Wenck became a kind of talisman, the last reason to believe that something could still change, that the situation could still somehow be reversed. What was actually happening was this. The 12th Army pushed east far enough to make contact with the remnants of the 9th Army, which had been encircled by Soviet forces southeast of Berlin and was trying to break out westward with whatever was left of its strength. Wenck's forces opened a corridor. Through that corridor came soldiers from the 9th Army, and with them and behind them came civilians, the refugees who had been waiting for exactly this moment, the people who had been told or had simply understood that this was their one chance to reach the western side of the line before it closed. For several days in late April and early May 1945, the corridor held. People moved through it. The numbers are difficult to establish with complete precision, but the estimates suggest that somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 people, soldiers and civilians together, crossed the Elbe to American captivity through the passage that Wenck's army created and held open. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler killed himself in the Führerbunker. He had waited for Wenck until the end. The relief that was never coming had been one of the last things he believed in. On May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Walter Wank was taken into American custody, held for questioning, and released relatively quickly by the standards of senior Wehrmacht officers. He had surrendered to the Americans, which was the outcome he had planned for. He had not been involved in SS operations or war crimes in the way that contaminated the records of many of his contemporaries. He was a professional soldier who had done his job, made one decisive and consequential decision in the final days of the war, and then accepted the consequences of Germany's defeat with the same professional composure that had characterized everything else he did. He was released from captivity in 1947 and spent the rest of his life in West Germany, working in business, living quietly, occasionally giving interviews to historians who were piecing together the story of the war's final weeks. He died on May 1st, 1982, in Hereford, at the age of 81. The historical judgment on Walter Wenck is genuinely complicated in a way that is worth taking seriously rather than resolving too quickly in either direction. He served the Wehrmacht loyally and effectively for the entire war. He was a professional instrument of a criminal regime, and the 12th Army he commanded in the final weeks was fighting in service of a government that had committed crimes of a scale and a deliberateness that history had never seen before. The fact that he disobeyed his final orders does not erase the years of service that preceded that disobedience. He was not a resistance figure. He was not someone who spent the war looking for opportunities to undermine the regime. He was a professional soldier who did his job until the very end, and then at the very end made one decision that pointed in a different direction. But that decision matters. It matters because of the 100,000 people, or the 200,000 people, or however many it actually was, who crossed the Elbe because of what he chose to do. Those people were real. Their survival was real. The choice he made to look at his orders and his maps and the human reality in front of him and decide that the civilians in those forests deserved more from him than one final futile charge into Soviet lines was a real choice made under real pressure with real consequences. He could have done what his orders said. He could have driven east and destroyed his army against the Soviet forces surrounding Berlin and died in the rubble of a city that was already lost. That would have been obedience. Instead, he chose something else. He chose to be useful in the only way that was still available to him, not to the regime that had issued his orders, not to the Führer waiting in his bunker, but to the people who were trapped between armies and needed someone with tanks and soldiers to hold a door open long enough for them to walk through it. Hitler waited for Wenck until the end. Wenck never came. And the people who crossed the Elbe because of that decision lived lives that they would not otherwise have lived, in a world that continued after the regime that had consumed everything around it finally collapsed into the rubble it had made of Europe. That is the story of Walter Wenck, the last general Hitler trusted, and the one who betrayed him. And in the specific circumstances of April 1945, that betrayal was the most human thing anyone in a German uniform managed to do.